Hello, and thank you very much for coming along to another program in EcoViews and News. Today, once again, we're going to be looking at Grassroots Global. People who made a difference on the grassroots leadership level and the global visionary level. And for today's consideration, we're going to look at the very important contribution of Tim DeChristopher, who just recently got out of jail. And this is some time he spent in jail, actually, as part of a sentence that he was given for, in effect, what we are heroizing him for at this point. That is to say, he was very important in articulating the case against the fossil fuel industry and the sale of public lands to the fossil fuel industry illegally under the last few days of the Bush administration. He disrupted an auction. He disrupted it by showing up and bidding on things. He bid on things because he was convinced that there weren't legitimate sales going on, and in the process he was arrested after the auction and tried, sentenced, and did hard jail time. Now, we spent a lot of time, in effect, looking at those who've taken symbolic arrest as a platform and as a form of protest. Bill McKibben, for example, and Jim Hansen, both of whom got arrested outside the White House to protest the pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline. But Tim DeChristopher not only got himself arrested, he actually spent some hard time in jail for his convictions on protecting public lands from the abuse of the extractive industries, the fossil fuel industries. Amy Goodman covered it at the time, and it's worth recapturing the reporting.
The Bureau of Land Management held a controversial auction Friday to sell oil and gas drilling rights to nearly 150,000 acres of wilderness in southern Utah. The sale had been strongly opposed by many environmental groups. Stephen Block of the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance said, quote, "This is the fire sale, the Bush administration's last great gift to the oil and gas industry."
Okay, now that was it. The fire sale. The Bush and Cheney administration realized they only had a few days left, and they held this auction in a very rushed way to sell off exploitation rights to public lands. This is outrageous. It was outrageous at the time, and the one key person on the spot who realized it was outrageous and went to the auction was Tim Christopher, and he actually intervened very strategically.
A coalition of environmental groups opposed to energy development on public lands filed a lawsuit last week to block the auction. They struck a deal with the Bureau of Land Management that allowed the auction to proceed on the condition that the leases on the most contested portions of the land will not be issued for another 30 days until a federal judge hears the case. Actor Robert Redford has been among those speaking out against the sale of these lands.
Now, Amy then quotes Robert Redford, actually interviews or takes a segment of an interview specifically with reference to the leasing of public lands for oil extraction, oil and gas extraction. And she gives a fairly lengthy moment for him to speak here. It's pretty interesting to see.
Someone who's been there and testified to the fact that there's no place like these lands. These lands are not Cheney's and Bush's. The lands are ours. They're ours because they're part of our legacy. They're part of the human American legacy. No place on earth, as Congressman Barrett has said, no place on earth can speak to the balance of beauty and nature like these areas. And the fact that they would, there's so much deception, so much sleight of hand here. I mean, how would you feel if you had an heirloom that was centuries old in your family, that someone came in while you were not looking? or they distracted you by creating something over here and they took it away from you, how would you feel? This is not their land. It's our land. These are public lands, and the BLM is supposed to be protecting those lands on our behalf. Now, once these lands are taken away, they're gone, and gone doesn't come back. So I feel pretty strongly that we have to do everything. It isn't a question of trying to talk to them. Forget that. That doesn't work. They've been trashing the environment ever since they came in, almost like they had a duty to do so. But when they trash our lands and not theirs and claim it's their prerogative, then something's pretty criminal. So I say stop it. Enough is enough. Not only will it not serve the purpose they keep stating, it's not going to provide any new energy. It's going to pollute what we've already got, and it's going to take away something that is ours to give to our children, their children, and their children, and their children. So I feel pretty strongly about this. I appreciate being given the chance to speak to it. As I said before, it's an emotional situation for me, and we should not allow this to happen. It's criminal.
Actor Robert Redford opposing the sale of Utah wilderness to oil and gas companies. While many environmental groups launch campaigns to oppose the sale of the land, one student in Salt Lake City attempted to block the sale by disrupting the auction itself. 27-year-old Tim DeChristopher posed as a potential bidder and bid hundreds of thousands of dollars on parcels of the land, driving up prices and winning some 22,000 acres for himself without any intention of paying for them. The Bureau of Land Management must now wait over a month before it can auction off these properties, but by then the Bureau will no longer be run by the Bush administration. Tim DeChristopher was arrested Friday and is scheduled to appear in court later today. He joins us in Salt Lake City. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Tim DeChristopher.
Good morning, Amy. It's great to be here.
Well,
I read your book last summer and really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks. Why don't you start off by telling us what happened on Friday? What did you start off planning to do that day? Where were you?
I started off actually at a final exam at the university and went straight from there down to the BLM office. And I saw some protesters walking back and forth outside. And I knew that I wanted to do more than that, and that this kind of injustice demanded a higher level of disruption. And so I just decided that I wanted to go inside and cause a bigger disruption. And from there I found it really easy to get inside and become a bidder. And went inside and was in the auction room. And once I was in there, I realized that any kind of speech or disruption or something like that wasn't going to be very effective. But I saw pretty quickly that I could have a pretty major impact on the way this worked. And just took me a little bit of time to build up the courage to do that, knowing what the consequences would be. And so I started bidding and started driving up the prices for some of the oil companies. And throughout that time, I knew that I could be doing more and could really set aside some acres to really be protected. And so then I started winning bids and disrupting it as clearly as I could.
Now, how does it work? You get a paddle?
Yeah, just had a bidder paddle and just kept raising it as much as I could.
And you ended up buying, what, over 22,000 acres of land?
Right.
And where was this land?
Honestly, I didn't know at the time, but now it turns out that a lot of that land was the land right around Arches National Park, in Labyrinth Canyon and Mineral Point and beautiful places like that. So it turned out pretty well.
And now what are your intentions? Or first I should ask, what was the response of the people in the room? When did they understand who you were, or did they at the time?
Once I started buying up every parcel, they understood pretty clearly what was going on. And so at that point they stopped the auction, and some federal agents came in and took me out.
Okay, well, that was the strategy. Go and get a bidders panel, bid on just about every piece of land that was up for sale, and then they realized what he was up to, and they closed down the auction and took him away. Now, this is a pretty extraordinary act. He came out of a final exam, right? University exam, goes down, sees what's going on, and steps right into the fray. This is an extraordinary act of civil action on his part. And he reflects on it later, actually. It's very worth following all the interviews with Tim DeChristopher, because he was a man of reflection but also of action. Take a look at an interview he later posted about how that same procedure went on.
When they first announced the parcels that were up for auction in December, it included parcels of land in the city of Moab that had houses on them. It included the Moab golf course. It was clear that they just hadn't even looked at what they were trying to rush out the door. It was rushed because it was the very last auction of the Bush administration. Oil and gas auctions happen quarterly, but the process of redoing a resource management plan is a really huge process that takes many years. That whole process was required in order to open up new lands for drilling, which during every previous administration were off limits. So they had to kind of time it so that they could rewrite the rules that would allow them to drill in these areas and then hold the auction as quickly as possible, because they knew that the future administrations probably would not allow these lands to be drilled. And in fact, the Obama transition team had already indicated that before the auction happened, that they thought this process was inappropriate. There was a protest that was being organized outside of this auction. So I got there and briefly talked to a couple of them and said, hey, let's go inside. That's where the action is. We've got to disrupt things in there. And they said, oh, they won't even let you in. Security will just drag you out at the door. And I said, well, then let's get dragged out at the door and at least make that statement. And rather than drag me out, they said, hi, are you here for the auction? And I said, yes, I am. And they said, would you like to be a bidder? And I said, yes, I would. And so I signed in where it said, yes, I understand that it's a offense to bid without the intent to pay. And so at that point, they signed me in and gave me bid card number 70.
Now, as it turns out, that's crucial. Bid card number 70. Keep it in mind, because there is now a movie out based on his life and his action called Bidder 70. It's going to be released publicly about the middle of May, but it's been released in a few theaters so far, and it's a pretty amazing movie. It's a documentary of his intervention, and then his going to prison and his statements about it since. Inside the auction room, he explains what went on.
It was pretty cold, emotionally. It was just very, very businesslike. They weren't describing the parcels when they were auctioning them off. It was just kind of like number 3, 6, 5, 7, 8, just very sterile. There was actually a woman that I knew from church that was sitting on the other side of the room and in the back, and she started to become emotional just about how cold and heartless this whole process was. And she actually started crying. She was obviously feeling that as a sadness, and I was feeling it more as an anger. And so I started out bidding just to drive up the prices. And so I was being effective with that, but also still seeing that there was the opportunity to do more. That I had the potential to actually win those parcels and possibly create enough chaos that would still be up in the air for the new administration, and that there was a chance that those parcels could be protected and that oil kept in the ground. At the time I was thinking, if I do this, I'll probably go to prison for 2 or 3 years. Could I live with that? And I thought, yeah, it would suck really bad, but I could live with it. But on the other hand, if I see this opportunity right in front of me and turn my back on it, could I live with that? And that's what I struggled with for maybe 20 or 30 minutes. And finally came to the realization that if I had to deal with all the things that we're on track for right now, all these catastrophic impacts of climate change and the unprecedented human suffering, knowing that I had an opportunity to do something about it and I didn't do it, I really couldn't live with that. That's something that I couldn't have on my conscience. And once I made that decision, I just started winning every single parcel. And so after I'd won 14 in a row, they stopped the auction, and an agent came over to me and said, we need to talk outside. And at that point asked me basically what I was doing there. And I told him flat out, my intention is to disrupt this auction in any way that I can. And so at that point they took me into custody and questioned me for several more hours before releasing me.
Okay. Well, coming soon, the consequences. Take a look at these interviews. They're unbelievable, really. In some sense, premeditated, but in other senses, right on the spot. That is, he comes out of an exam that he's taken at the university and realizes that everything he's been studying is right there in front of his eyes, and he better do something about it. And sure enough, he does something about it by disrupting the auction, by, in effect, taking a bidders panel and bidding in a way that no one expected anybody to do, so much so that they call off the auction eventually and take him out and arrest him. Take a look at what happens. He's eventually tried and there's a verdict of guilty. He comes out of the courthouse where the guilty verdict is.
What the world wanted to see was how you would react. And you all have reacted with joy and resolve. You've shown that your power will not be intimidated by any power that they have. And that's the most important thing that has happened here this week. Because everything that went on inside that building tried to convince me that I was alone and that I was weak. They tried to convince me that I was like a little finger out there on my own that could easily be broken. And all of you out here were the reminder for all of us that I wasn't just a finger all alone in there, but that I was connected to a hand with many fingers that could unite as one fist. And that fist could not be broken by the power that they have in there. That fist is not a symbol of violence. That fist is a symbol that we will not be misled into thinking we are alone. We will not be lied to and told we are weak. We will not be divided, and we will not back down. That fist is a symbol that we are connected and that we are powerful. It's a symbol that we hold true to our vision of a healthy and just world, and we are building the self-empowering movement to make it happen. All those authorities in there wanted me to think like a finger, but our children are calling to us to think like a fist.
Okay, think like a fist. Now this is pretty dramatic. Right after his sentencing, or actually the verdict. He hasn't yet been sentenced. He gives a whole series of interviews, and you should pick them up between the verdict and the sentencing, which are very important actually as well. But eventually he is freed, and after having served 18 months. Once again, Amy covers this on Democracy Now!, and you should follow it from now on in. Take a look.
As the world marks Earth Day, we spend the rest of the hour with climate justice activist Tim DeChristopher, who's just been released after 21 months in federal custody. Tim DeChristopher was convicted of interfering with a public auction in 2008 when he disrupted the Bush administration's last-minute move to auction off oil and gas exploitation rights in Utah, where he was a student at the time. DeChristopher posed as a bidder, won drilling lease rights to 22,000 acres of land in an attempt to save the property from oil and gas extraction. The in itself was later overturned and declared illegal, a fact that Tim's defense attorneys were prevented from telling the jury. They were also barred from informing jurors that Tim had raised the money for the initial payment to the Bureau of Land Management, a payment the BLM refused to accept. Tim DeChristopher's case is the subject of a documentary called Bidder 70, which will screen all over the country today to mark his release as well as Earth Day. Tim DeChristopher will give his first public address tonight at the Salt Lake City screening, which will be streamed to theaters around the country.
Okay. Now, if you were in Salt Lake, you probably had a chance to see that. Or if you were in a feeding theater that had the direct connection to the Salt Lake screening, you could have seen it. But a lot of us didn't see it. Take a look at the trailer, though. It's pretty interesting.
Quarter in the back and not a 2.5. 2.5 to 2. Thank you, I have 3.5.
They said, "Are you here for the auction?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "Are you here to be a bidder?" And I said, Well, yes, I am.
So $50 ticket number 7B. It is 7B.
An environmentalist threw a controversial oil and gas lease auction into turmoil today.
Well, Tim DeChristopher says he's willing to go to jail, and it's possible that's where he'll wind up.
I think it's fair to say you are unrepentant.
Yes, I think that would be fair to say.
This is the formal charges against me. United States of America versus Tim DeChristopher.
Do you feel outnumbered?
A little bit. 300 million to 1.
When you take a courageous action that's based in heart and courage, as Tim did, you'll have people stand with you and beside you and follow in your footsteps.
This is not the first time that we've had 10,000 people in one room reminding us that we are not alone.
12 citizens like you or I ought to be able to hear what the evidence is, and then they make the decision as to whether or not he committed a violation of law or the government did at the time.
To see this land and this view, and to know there's not going to be an oil rig in the way, there's not going to be a road cut right through the middle of it. There's no way that I could ever regret what I did.
Civil disobedience is forever linked not to living one's principles, but being willing to suffer for those principles.
When they close that door behind you, they don't open up till they decide to let you go.
The way the environmental movement has been, it's like a football game. And our team is getting slaughtered. The refs have been paid off, and the other side is playing with dirty tricks. And so it's no longer acceptable for us to stay in the stands. It's time to rush the field. And it's time to stop the game.
Okay, it's time to stop the game. It's pretty amazing stuff, and we'll see it within a month. Probably it's 17th. It's going to be released publicly around the country. But keep an eye out for it. It's going to be called Bitter 70, and it's based on this kind of intervention. It's, as he says, it's time to rush the field. Take a look at some of the further interviews that Amy has put up there, but also look to the text. He's actually put out a statement that's worth reading from top to bottom, and the principal case for the protection of public lands. This is absolutely crucial. Keep in touch and keep looking for Tim DeChristopher's statement. That's now that he's out of prison, we're going to be hearing more and more of his things, I would think. Keep in touch here on air and online, and we'll keep you in touch with what he's saying.